Hello and welcome to Media Focus. I am Michael Collins, and in this video we are going to be taking a brief look at the history of video games. So the topics that we're going to be covering today include looking at a few key examples of technological innovations. So video games which have done something to really break the mold, to do something interesting, and to shake up the industry. We are also going to be looking at the relationship between major producers and independent producers and how these two different producers coexist, often uneasily, within the same industry. We are also going to be looking at various controversies, for example, controversial video games and controversial working practices as well. And at this stage, I would like to note that this video does make reference to some adult themes and also some fairly disturbing issues as well. So viewer discretion is advised. So this is a fairly lengthy video, and I just want to briefly discuss why it is that I'm doing this. So one of the things that you will need to discuss in the exam is this idea of video game production, distribution, and circulation. And one of the things that we need to consider in media studies is that every industry that we look at is a specialized industry. And this means that every industry that we look at works in a completely different way. So the film industry, for example, is still, in this day, somewhat dependent on films being produced, on films being made in studios, films being distributed at film festivals, films having a run in cinemas before then being released in home formats, and then being streamed on digital streaming services, for example, Netflix. Television is, of course, completely different from film, even though a lot of TV shows, for example, Debs and Game of Thrones and whatever, do look very similar to films now. They are distributed and produced in a completely different way and often for completely different audiences. And one of the things that we need to consider for the video game industry is that it has its own peculiarities. It has its own niche, and it does things which are very different. So we need to consider this for the history of video games. We need to consider where it is that video games came from, how it is that video games are distributed, and how it is that video games are made as well. So as you're watching this video, what I would like you to do is I would like you to make extensive notes from the slides that I'm going to be showing you. Now, you are not going to be able to get all of this information into the exam, and I absolutely do ask you to not put all of this information into the exam because you will not be asking the question which is being set. However, the notes are going to give you what is known as a contextual knowledge of the video game industry. By having this knowledge of the industry, this is really going to help you to push your answer forward. And this is also going to help you to have a knowledge of an industry, which, quite frankly, you might not have this pre-existing knowledge of. And I do completely understand that students do have completely different experiences of the video game industry to a far greater extent than something like the film industry. So let's get started. In order to consider the video game industry, we need to look way back at the birth of the industry. One thing that I find particularly interesting is this idea that the video game industry is a new industry. And it's not. It's absolutely not at all. Now, it might be new in terms of other media industries, even the film industry. However, it extends much further back than most people realize. On the screen at the moment is a shot of what is often considered to be the first video game. This game, Spacewar, was first released in 1962, so significantly before the arcade boom of the late 1970s. This game was made in an American computer laboratory, and essentially it's a proof of concept. It is an idea of what can be possible through games and what can be possible through computers. The idea of it being a commercial product is very, very much at the back of the minds of the people who made it. Instead, this is a proof of concept. This is what can computers do. And it's also worth noting that this game, Spacewar, which again is considered to be one of the very first video games, is a shoot 'em up. It is a game where you play a spaceship and you fly around the screen and you shoot other things there. And we can also see from the screen there as well, we have this remarkably prescient way of controlling the video game as well, with a series of switches, paddles and whatever. So actually the very first video games were remarkably similar to games which are released now. However, there is a huge barrier of entry to actually play games like this. If you wanted to play Spacewar in 1962, then you would actually have to be part of the institution which actually had this game. You would actually have to be studying computer science. You would probably actually have to be working on the team as well. In fact, video games technically extend further back beyond this as well. And one of the very first video games I managed to find in my research is this game Drafts, which was first made for the Nimrod computer in 1952. Now, this computer didn't even have a cathode ray tube screen, such as we might see today. Instead, it had a series of various lights which would flick up on the screen, and the computer itself was programmed with a series of punch cards. This, by modern standards, is extremely rudimentary, and yet the Nimrod computer was absolutely vast. So even to run something as straightforward as Drafts, probably one of the most simple board games there is out there, took this vast amount of technological know-how and this vast amount of equipment in order to be able to run. But we can see that video games, maybe not as we know them today, do extend back significantly more than half a century at this stage. Again, once more, the only people who could actually play this game, though, would be academics, would be technicians, would be people who actually worked on the game itself. The first game to be released commercially is often considered to be Computer Space, which was released in 1971. So we're still thinking of a significant time in the past. And as we can see from this contemporary advert, the game has a lot of similarities to modern upright arcade cabinets as well, although the actual cabinet itself is this wonderful kind of 1970s retro futurist design. We can also see from the advertising as well that video games are marketed in a remarkably similar way. We have this attractive woman standing there holding the arcade cabinet. We can't actually see a shot of the actual video game, and maybe that's not as important as the actual visuals. You can check out footage of Computer Space running on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet. You'll see the graphics are remarkably rudimentary, but on the other hand, there's still a lot of similarities with modern games. If we have a look at the control pad there as well, we can see there's a series of buttons as opposed to any joysticks or any analog sticks or anything along those lines. So still fairly simple, but not a million miles away from the kind of games that we play today. Of course, video games didn't really kind of ignite the public imagination until they became particularly widespread. And the first home video game is often cited as being Pong. Now, Pong was released in arcades before this, but also a home version was released by Atari starting from 1974. Now, Pong is an extremely straightforward video game. It's table tennis. There are two lines on screen. One player controls one of the lines and the other player controls the other line, and a little ball bounces between the two of them. So we can see that one of the very first video games is not actually a shoot 'em up. It doesn't involve any guns or anything like that. It's actually a sport simulation game, which is a genre which remains popular to this very day. Now, Pong really captured the public imagination, and if you watch any films from the 1970s, you'll often see Pong machines being played at home and being played at arcades. And yeah, again, really captured the public imagination. Of course, video games didn't really kind of capture the imagination until they exploded into the arcades. And probably the video game which did most for raising the perception of video games beyond things like Pong, which were pretty much a distraction, was the game Space Invaders. Released by Taito in 1979, Space Invaders was a shoot 'em up. You control a small ship at the bottom of the screen, and a wave of invaders scroll down the screen towards you, and the player has to shoot them down. And this game included many innovative factors, which ended up being in many games from this point onwards. So it had things like lives. If you get hit, you lose a life. If you get hit 3 times, you lose all your lives. It also had a score as well. Every time you hit one of the invaders, you get a certain amount of points, and people within the arcade could fight for high scores. It being an arcade game, you also had to pay as well, 100 yen in Japan. And you could, again, keep playing for as long as possible. So as long as you were good enough, your 100 yen could take, many hours of playtime. Of course, if you were bad, you would be dead within a matter of seconds, but the array of color and noises on screen was particularly exciting for audiences at the time. It's important to note that this game isn't actually in color, and the green effect at the bottom of the screen was achieved by simply putting some plastic overlays over the top of the screen. What's really interesting about Space Invaders is that while other games like Pong and Spacewar and stuff like that just literally have a series of dots and stuff and the player has to use their imagination, with Space Invaders we don't really need to use our imagination so much. We can actually see that there are a series of various squid-like beings coming down the screen towards us. And along with a soundtrack which is not particularly exciting, but at the time must have felt pretty threatening, this kind of beep, beep, beep noise, which gradually increases in tempo. So once more at this stage, we can still see many of the elements that modern video games have. Now, Space Invaders massively took off in Japan, and to such an extent that we had this phenomena of invaders halls. So entire buildings, entire rooms which are dedicated to people coming and playing Space Invaders. And this was the genesis, if you will, of modern arcades. Anecdotally, Space Invaders was so popular in Japan that there was a national shortage of 100 yen coins because so many of them were being pumped into the Space Invaders machines. And there were also reports as well of delinquents and violence and criminal gangs congregating around invaders halls, which led to the first moral panic which involved video games. And this idea that video games are involved in deviancy is something which is stuck with the medium for many, many years and even today. Now, it wasn't just Japan who really got involved in the arcade boom, and just a few years later, we have games like Centipede being released in America. So once more, just like with Pong, the company we see here is Atari. Now, Atari didn't actually develop Centipede, but they did publish it. And Centipede was an interesting one because, first of all, it's in color. And secondly, it has a more varied soundtrack than Space Invaders does, although again, it's a load of bleeps and blops. But Centipede as well uses a really innovative control methods. The player can use a trackball similar to an upturned mouse to control their I've no idea what it is you actually play in Centipede, little gunman, while a series of threats come down the screen and you've got to hide behind mushrooms and stuff like that. It's all very cool. From a shot on the screen as well, we can see exactly how arcade games were marketed at the time. Loads and loads of colour and loads of bright explosions. And these will be placed on the side of the arcade cabinet and on the marquee, which is the display which is just above the screen. Now, because a lot of these games didn't really have particularly impressive graphics, especially compared to films which are coming out at the time, arcade games really had to sell themselves through their marquee graphics. So we can definitely see at this stage that advertising was really, really important for video games, and the violence and the aggression and the excitement of the video games really, really jumping out here. So this is a couple of different views of the arcade scene, which was really, really bumping up. Now, why was it that people were going to buildings to play games in arcades? Why weren't they playing it at home? Well, the reason for this was that video games were extremely expensive and nobody could actually afford to actually have an arcade cabinet at home. And however, there were consoles, there were things that you could play at home. So this British microcomputer, the ZX Spectrum, was particularly popular, especially in the UK and Europe as well. And as we can see through looking at the screen here, the graphics, again, fairly rudimentary. This is not really something which would set the arcades on fire. But one thing which is really, really important about the ZX Spectrum was that it allowed audiences to create their own games. And we had, especially in the UK, and this is something that we were very, very good at, this rise of bedroom coders. So often teenagers who would make games in their bedrooms and often would sell them for a fairly lucrative business there. If you want to see a really, really good contemporary example of 1980s bedroom coders, check out the film / video game Bandersnatch on Netflix, which is a really, really excellent fictionalized account of what it was like to be a bedroom coder and exactly how many of these developers often, used to launch into the big time. So on the left there, we have the classic British game School Days, where essentially you are a naughty school child who runs around a school and avoids teachers and things like that. And, it's a classic example of the kind of creativity which was coming out in the UK at that stage. And there were loads and loads of creativity at this stage. So while in the arcades, we had loads and loads of explosions and shooting and stuff like that. In the 1980s, especially British developers, and I keep going back to British developers here, were making some really, really interesting stuff. Often not very good, often not very fun to play, but still interesting nonetheless. So these games would take many, many different forms. On the top right, we have a video game, Gertie Goose, again for the Spectrum, which, again, you play a goose, you run around a farm, you do stuff. It's pretty much a predecessor of the very popular Untitled Goose Game, although it came out many, many years beforehand. We also have things like quizzes and stuff like that. So Tellywise, where, lots and lots of quizzes. And I think actually that might be a simulation game where you run like a TV station. I know there's lots of stuff like that. And this vampire game on the bottom left, where you run around a vampire house and get bitten by spiders and stuff like that. So loads and loads of experimentation at this stage. However, one of the big issues with home video games was that their quality varied absolutely massively. So while there are some excellent examples of video games from the 1980s on consoles such as the Atari and the ZX Spectrum and stuff like that, you'll notice that these really aren't talked about in the same hushed tones as other games, for example, Mario. And I'm sorry if I'm going to sound slightly controversial here. One of the reasons for this was a lot of these games were utterly crap. So much so that one video game in particular, which was so bad that it's often credited with completely destroying the home game industry. Now, video games in the early 80s just didn't have the same quality control that games do now. And often games rushed out very, very quickly on the basis that, well, who cares? You could sell them fairly expensively and just, anyone would go off and buy them. And probably the most famous example of this was the game E.T., which was developed and released by Atari. The game was rushed out extremely quickly in order to cash in on the film. And although the developer who made it was a very respected developer, actually, and made lots of really interesting games like Yar's Revenge beforehand. Although, yeah, he was a very good developer. Unfortunately, I think he only had something like 4 weeks to rush out this game. And essentially, the game itself was pretty much a big crock. The game was so bad that essentially no one bought it, despite the fact that Atari produced millions and millions of these cartridges. And in the end, Atari, to save face, ended up secretly burying loads and loads of these cartridges in a big landfill in the Nevada desert. This is often considered to be an urban legend for many years, but a recent documentary on Netflix, a bunch of people investigating this and then going out to the Nevada desert, actually managed to find one of these ET landfills. It actually did exist. So consumer confidence in video games was massively, massively low after this. This is one of the reasons why essentially in the early 80s, the video game industry just was completely destroyed, and Atari's fortunes just completely went down, and you can check out loads and loads of stuff like this on YouTube. Another reason why the video game industry in the 1980s crashed wasn't just because games were bad, but often because they were absolutely disgusting and vile as well. With absolutely no regulation of the video game industry, we had games like Custer's Revenge being released. So this was released on the Atari video game console, the same console that ET was released on. As we can see at the bottom, Mystique is not affiliated with Atari Inc. So, you could just release games if you wanted to, as long as you just put a little stamp on the bottom saying this is unofficial. But Custer's Revenge, I'm not going to show you any gameplay footage from it, but essentially you play an American colonizer, and you essentially walk towards a tied up Native American woman while dodging arrows in order to rape her. And there were other video games like this, but this really just does indicate just some of the absolute filth and crap which was coming out in the video game industry at this time. So what this did was this cultivated this idea that not only were video games kind of awful and a complete waste of time, but also that they were really gross and that they were really offensive as well. And this really, really kind of shook the face of video games, and it really kind of cultivated this stigma against them as well. And it's one of the many reasons why video games completely crashed in the 1980s. However, video games did soldier on, and broadly it is very much up to Japan in this case to save the video game industry. So while console games kind of crashed, PC games kind of soldiered on. And in Japan, we had various different games which were imported and ended up becoming very popular. So on the left, we have a shot from the dungeon crawler game Wizardry, which was released in the mid-1980s. This game is first-person perspective game, which is pretty exciting at the time, although as you can see from the graphics, it's completely black and white, completely wireframe, no actual features, anything like that. Everything has to happen in the mind of the audience. Now, Wizardry was essentially based on the board game, the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons, and it took all of its systems and ideas from Dungeons and Dragons and allowed the player to essentially play Dungeons and Dragons on a computer. But one of the cool things about Wizardry was that it did extremely well in Japan for whatever reason. And it sold, a ridiculous amount of units in Japan and essentially led to a big franchise. And this idea of a role-playing game, of a game where you run around a dungeon and you hit goblins and orcs and stuff like that. So very Lord of the Rings, and you've got things like hit points and stuff like that. So all these conventions of the role-playing game. Well, this is very popular in Japan, but this ended up being tweaked in order to kind of make it a little bit more Japanese, a little bit more suitable for Japanese tastes. So on the right there, we have the game Dragon Quest, which was a ridiculously popular game, absolutely massive, released on the Famicom or the Nintendo Entertainment System. And what this game did was it took all of the complicated systems of games like Wizardry and it simplified them massively for a younger audience. And it also gave the audience things like color. and things like portraits of their characters as well. So while the game on the right there might look extremely basic from modern standards, it completely captured the mind of the audience, and it became an absolutely massive hit. And this kind of role-playing game also we saw continued in other games like Final Fantasy, and eventually loads and loads of other games in this genre as well. So we can see how various different American, like Western games, were essentially taken by Japan and then turned into something which was far more commercial. So what we start to see during the 1980s is very much this split in between Japanese games and Western games. And so looking here on this screen here, these are 4 examples of what we call adventure games. So these games are often very much text-based. You will explore somewhere, you'll talk to people, and you'll solve puzzles. And on the left, we have 2 examples of Japanese games, both of these released for Japanese computers. And on the right, we have 2 Western games, both of these released for Western computers. And this really does demonstrate the fact that at this stage in video game history, Japanese video games were significantly more sophisticated than Western games. They were much more complicated. They were much more text heavy. They were much more pushing ideas like narrative, and they were pushing the systems much, much more. And this demonstrates that even at this stage, we have certain preferences to certain styles of video games. So on the top right, we have the American game Shadowgate, for example, which was released on many different computers. This is on the Apple Macintosh. And on the bottom right, we have the British game Fantastic Dizzy. This here was released on the ZX Spectrum and lots of other British computers. And these differ very, very wildly to the Japanese adventure games that we see on the left. So on the top left, we have the game Snatcher, here for the PC 88. On the bottom left, I can't actually remember the name of the game, but it does demonstrate the difference in the graphical prowess of Japanese and Western games. So all this is very good, all this is cool, but at this stage, video games are very, very much a minority pursuit. After the video game industry crashed in the 1980s, very much seen that video games are for nerds, they're for geeks, they're for people who want to sit there and solve puzzles and, read lots of text and, even get coding themselves and make their own video games and kind of share them with other people. So it's very, very much the pursuit of enthusiasts. However, in 1985, a game was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan, which completely changed everything. And this game was Super Mario Brothers. So this was a sequel to Nintendo's own Mario Brothers, but it is an example of what we call a platformer. So Mario runs through this world, bangs his head on bricks, jumps on mushrooms, takes mushrooms and grows really big. Some slight drug references going on there. And this game completely captured the imagination of the public. There was nothing techie here. There were no there's no barrier to entry. A 3-year-old child can pick up Super Mario Brothers and they can have an absolutely wonderful time with it. And this completely changed the approach to video games, and this completely changed this idea. So suddenly they're not necessarily for ultra nerds, but now instead anyone can pick up a video game and there's much less of a barrier to entry. Even today, the first Super Mario Brothers game, which was released in 1985, 1986, is extremely accessible for audiences. It's got a full-on soundtrack. It has lots and lots of different colors. It has a character that we can identify instantly. He looks extremely distinctive. And also the game scrolls as well. So instead of just like a lot of British platformers at the time, just you running around a single screen and jumping on stuff, if you move to the right of the screen in this, the camera scrolls with you. And of course, today that doesn't seem particularly exciting, but at this stage, absolutely wonderful. So this was seen as very, very much a feat of technical engineering. But Mario Brothers was also an excellent example of game design as well. So developed by the now infamous Shigeru Miyamoto, Super Mario Brothers invited the audience to explore the world in which this was set. This isn't just about running through the game and then getting to the end and then putting it aside. The whole idea about Super Mario Brothers is that you can play and replay this game. And this completely shaped the idea of video games. Not that they are just some simple throwaway pursuit, but this is something which you can actually get very good at. And this is something where you can find something in the game that other people are not going to be able to find. So again, this completely changed this perspective on video games. Now, this idea that video games could be cool and interesting and fun, and most of all played with other people, really came to its zenith in the game Street Fighter II, released by Capcom in 1991. Now, no one remembers Street Fighter 1 because it sucked. It was very basic, very rudimentary. It had this mechanic where the harder you pushed the button, the harder your character punched or kicked, which ended up wrecking loads and loads of arcade cabinets. So it wasn't particularly popular. But Street Fighter 2 took the genre, which is beat 'em up, and fighting game. Beat 'em up is something different, and we can see exactly how nerdy video games get. But Street Fighter 2 is a versus fighting game. So you pick your character, you stand in an exciting location, and you punch and kick them until their health runs out, which is obviously all extremely exciting for audiences. Now, this kind of game has existed for many years beforehand, but it was Street Fighter 2 which really took it and really changed it into something which, and I keep using this phrase, captured the public's imagination. Street Fighter 2 was an arcade game. And in Japan, the arcade cabinets were set out in such a way that you would not have to sit next to the person. So, they'll be sitting on the other side of the arcade cabinet and you wouldn't actually have to look them in the eye. But in places like the UK and America, Street Fighter 2 was generally installed on stand-up arcade cabinets where you would actually have to go into the arcade, where you would actually have to find someone playing this game. Then you would shove your 20p or whatever into the arcade cabinet, and then you would fight them, and you would stand right next to them. And that's quite an intimidating and exciting experience for audiences. Suddenly you're not actually playing against the machine, but you're playing against another player. And different players manage to discover all kinds of different strategies in order to beat other people. And this is a game which is still played today. And not only was it extremely popular in arcades, it was also extremely popular on home consoles. So on consoles at the time, such as the Mega Drive and also the Super Nintendo and stuff like that, audiences could play Street Fighter 2. They could take it home and they could play against other people. So Street Fighter 2 is basically the first game, arguably, which really emphasized this idea of competitive gaming and really became extremely popular because of it. Now, you can play Street Fighter 2 by yourself, but it's pretty boring and it's much, much more exciting to play with somebody else. So again, this is another huge innovation in the video game industry. So what we're seeing here is this difference between home games and arcade games. Now, a home game would be something that you could play at home. It's something that you take home. It's something that you plug into your television and that generally you play using a control pad. And modern examples of home video game systems include the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One as well. But at this stage, we had this very, very clear division between arcade games and console games. So this is a little bit unfair because I've picked a console game which came out a little bit before the arcade game on the right. I'm not entirely sure why I did that. But on the left, we have the game Alex Kidd in Miracle World. And this was released on the Sega Master System, which was a console which was not particularly popular in the UK, although it is extremely popular in Brazil. But going off on one here. And on the right, we have the arcade game OutZone, which was released by Toplan for arcades in 1990. So on the left, we have a platformer, fairly rudimentary, fairly basic, cheap and cheerful, although still actually pretty impressive for the console that it was released on. And on the right, we have something which just completely blows everything out the water. When you go into the arcades in the early 90s, you're going to play things which audiences, you're just not going to be able to do that at home. This is one of the big unique selling points of arcades. Yeah, you've got to pay each time you want to play the game, although technically it is cheaper, especially if you get good at the game, because then you can play for longer. But as we can see on the bottom right image here, we have these huge sprites. We have these huge images which are rendered in pixels, really, really complicated, really, really interesting. And this is going to be extremely exciting for audiences playing this game. Another thing as well is the soundtracks to these games, far, far more complicated, far, far more interesting, far louder as well in arcades, which is obviously extremely exciting for audiences. So we have this idea that arcade games are better than console games. And essentially, when you play a console game at home, you're slumming it. You're playing something which, ideally you'd want to be playing in the arcade, but, you'd lose all your money if you did that. Arcade games continued beyond this as well, and to some extent are still going today, although they're pretty much dead in the UK, with the exception of a few excellent arcades which are still going. One excellent example of a late period arcade game, and this is still in the same genre of OutZone, is the game Mushihimesama, which was released by Cave in 2004 for arcades. And this just demonstrates exactly what arcades had to do in order to still stay relevant to audiences. So every pink blob that you see on the screen is a bullet, and if you touch that bullet, you die. And if you look very, very carefully in the bottom right hand side, you can see the player character represented by a very small blue blob, which the player is desperately trying to keep out the way of all these different bullets. Mushihimesama is an extreme example, but this kind of demonstrates that certain industries, for example, the arcade video game industry, have and do still continue, although in a completely different way to what we're used to. And although arcade games used to be targeting very casual fans, so things like Pac-Man machines in pubs in the UK in the 1980s would target very kind of drunk, casual fans who just wanted to spend 10p just to move a character around. Nowadays, arcade games are marketed towards the hardest of the hardcore. And to be quite honest, unless you have a good grounding in arcade games, you're not going to be doing particularly well in a game like Mushihimesama. So in the mid-90s, we had this situation where we had these extremely technically wonderful arcade games and these more basic but still exciting home console games. And the games that tended to do the best were things like sports simulations, so quite similar to Pong in their way, and games like Mario, which were challenging to audiences, but were also fairly straightforward as well, and were often aimed at younger audiences. And I am talking extreme, I'm completely simplifying things to a massive degree here. So you can obviously think of many, many exceptions to these rules. But in general, these are the games that did particularly well. And there was very, very much a perception that the video game industry was primarily for children, was primarily for younger people. And in 1994, the situation was essentially, we had this big rivalry between Sega and their Mega Drive and Nintendo and their Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, Sega were very much about arcade games. They were very much about trying to take the arcade, experience home. So we had games like Altered Beast, for example, and Sonic the Hedgehog, which are exciting, fast-paced and colorful games. And then Nintendo did something slightly different with their Mario series, with their Kirby series, Zelda, Yoshi, and stuff like that, which were generally more more kind of family-friendly, more child-friendly games, which were deep and exciting and really, really rewarded repeat playing as well. But in general, as I say, this expectation that video games were for much younger audiences and weren't really worth checking out for older people. But then Sony decided that they wanted to make a video game console. Now, Sony, obviously extremely well-regarded computer manufacturer, electronics manufacturing company, famous for their innovations such as the Sony Walkman, the Discman, their cameras and stuff like that. But they decided that they would use their immense wealth and technological know-how to barge their way into the market, which they did so in 1995 or maybe 1994 with the Sony PlayStation, which is obviously to this day an extremely important and extremely popular brand. Now, Sony decided to take a completely different tack when it came to marketing video games. Now, for one thing, they really emphasized the idea that most of the games on their console were going to be in 3D. Now, this is very, very different to what had gone before. It was seen as very exciting, and while many of these games look very rough and ready compared to modern video games and the kind of stuff that we're used to now, this is still very exciting for audiences. And very, very quickly, audiences decided to move on from 2D games to 3D games, which completely stirred up the market. Another thing which Sony did, which is really interesting, was they decided to market their games towards older audiences, and they used a lot more interesting and weird advertising campaigns in order to do this. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, rather than setting up their consoles in things like toy shops and stuff like that, which was generally the thing which was done at the time, Sony decided to plonk one of their PlayStations in the nightclub, the Ministry of Sound, in order to target 18 plus audiences who were into things like clubbing. So games like Wipeout, the futuristic car racing game, was used to attract a new generation of video game players who perhaps used to play video games when they were younger, but maybe ditched them because they were too childish. And Sony's marketing campaigns were often extremely weird and often extremely controversial as well. So this screenshot here is from an advertising campaign, well, an advert called Mental Wealth, which was first aired in 1999. Directed by Chris Cunningham, we don't see any video game footage at all, or even any reference to PlayStation at all, but instead we see this CG augmented woman talking directly into the camera, her strong Scottish accent, talking about aliens and spacecrafts and stuff like that. And obviously we can't get away from the fact that she looks quite disturbing. So this odd, disturbing, kind of freaky video, and you can check it out on YouTube, just search for Sony Mental Wealth. Again, really captured the public's imagination. Essentially because this is something that audiences just simply were not used to seeing at this stage, that this was extremely exciting, that this was something particularly weird. This is a very, very different marketing strategy to someone like Nintendo, who would often show footage from the video game or might have some exciting voiceover on the top. This is a completely different way of marketing video games, an exciting way of marketing video games. And there was this idea at the time, and this is something that I remember vividly, there was this idea at the time that suddenly video games were very different. Video games were exciting, and there was something that adults could play as well. Now, Nintendo also innovated and also changed their perspective and pushed the technology which was available to them at the time to massive levels. So right here we have a screenshot from the video game Super Mario 64, which was released on the Nintendo 64 in 1996. Now, in many ways, Super Mario 64 is a classic Mario game. You explore, you pick up coins, you find secrets, you run around cool, green, exciting open spaces. But the big technological innovation here compared to early Mario games is, of course, that the game is in 3D. Now, I remember playing Super Mario 64 for the first time in Argos in King's Lynn on a setup there. And I remember my mind was absolutely blown by this game. So, for one thing, the game was not controlled using a digital D-pad, which is just a simple controller which just moves your character around the screen, a certain amount of steps. But instead, you controlled this game using something called an analog stick, which is something which is very, very much industry standard now. You move the controller a little bit and your character walks. You move the controller a lot and your character runs. And this is a huge technological marvel at the time. Although Nintendo definitely weren't the first company to do this, they were the first company to popularize this and to include analog sticks on their console as standard. Another thing which Super Mario 64 did very, very well is it made use of 3D space. Now, we had other video games beforehand which were in 3D. For example, the Crash Bandicoot series on the Sony PlayStation, which I think pipped Mario 64 to the post. But that was very, very much a 2D game with a kind of 3D makeover. Other games like Clockwork Knight and stuff like that kind of looked like they're in 3D, but they weren't actually in 3D. Mario 64 was in 3D. You could go up, you could go down, you could explore all different things. You would have to use the camera to look around, and it was very, very expertly crafted in this sense. So this is a world in which you could completely get lost in, and it was very, very much a glimpse into the future of video games. So once more, we see this huge gulf between Japanese games and Western games. But at this stage, we're starting to see that we're not seeing a technological gulf. We're not seeing a complete gulf in terms of expertise and creativity even. But what we are seeing is a difference in what Japanese consumers and what Western consumers actually want from their video games. So on the left and right here, we have two video games, both of them released in 1997. Both of them are RPGs. So thinking back to Dragon Quest, this is the same genre. But both of these games are very, very different from one another. So on the left, we have the video game Final Fantasy VII, which is an absolutely massive smash hit for Squaresoft and was released on the Sony PlayStation. And on the right, we have the video game Fallout. And both of these games are part of much larger franchises. Both of these game series are still going today. But just looking at these screenshots, we can see that there's a very real difference between the preferences of Japanese and Western consumers. Final Fantasy VII is much more story heavy. It does have things like statistics and numbers that you need to think about, but in general, the emphasis is on the atmosphere and the story. In Final Fantasy VII, you essentially run through a series of rooms and corridors in order to progress the story, and it is fairly linear in that sense. It is quite straightforward in terms of its narrative, even though it's a very long game with loads and loads of plot twists. However, Fallout did things completely differently. In Fallout, you pick your own character, you make your own character, and you can choose exactly how you want to play the game. So you can be a hero in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, saving people and generally being the good guy, or you can be an absolute bastard. You can run around, you can murder people, you can destroy the entire world around you. Literally, you can actually blow up the entire world. And also, as we can see through the game's HUD or HUD, i.e. the different stats and systems stuff which is on the screen, there's a lot more stats, there's a lot more stuff to think about. It's much more complicated, it's much more in-depth. Now, even though these games are both of the same genre, they both play in completely different ways. They both have completely different attitudes towards how a story is told in a video game. And this really kind of reflects exactly how diverse the video game industry is. So one video game is not similar to another video game in this sense. And no matter what your tastes are, there will be a video game out there which will interest you. And I think that's something which is really, really important to consider. So additionally, we're not just talking about an East and West divide here. We're also talking about a divide between independent video game producers and major video game producers. So on the left, we have the game Undertale, which was released for PC in 2011. I want to say 2011. This is an example of an independent video game. It is made primarily by one person, Toby Fox, who did most of the graphics and, programmed the game, made all the music and wrote all the story and stuff like that. Undertale is fairly straightforward, although it has a lot of interesting contexts and concepts and ideas behind it. It is fairly short. The game can be completed in roughly 6 hours. And it does all kinds of things which major label games, quite frankly, probably wouldn't do. It's quite interesting and different in terms of its style and its graphics. Although this is a modern video game, as we can see, its graphics are very, very straightforward, although they are quite stylistically interesting as well. So this is an example of an indie game. And although only a comparatively small number of people play Undertale, although it's extremely successful as an indie game, and you can download it for basically any modern console as well, such was its success. On the right, we have a shot from one of the games in the Gears of War franchise, which is a huge, mega budget video game with loads and loads of explosions and loads of guns to fire and loads of things to kill. Now, Undertale was primarily undertaken by a team of one person. Games like the Gears of War series take hundreds and hundreds of people in order to make them. We call a game like Gears of War a AAA game, which means it has very, very high production values. And generally, the mainstream video game audience is looking for things like this. And a game like Undertale, which is marketed towards a small and niche audience, games like Gears of War are marketed to a mass audience, people of all different ages. So that is perhaps the big difference between independent and major video games in terms of their production values and in terms of the audiences that they're going for. We also see indie video games are able to be far more creative in terms of what they do than major label games. So the video game industry is extremely restrictive, and in order to be extremely popular, arguably there's only a certain amount of routes that a video game developer can do. If you want your video game to be popular, well, you're probably going to have be able to shoot someone, because that's extremely popular. Or, at the very, very least, in the case of the FIFA series, you're going to have to kick around a ball and you're going to have to, play as your favorite characters. If you want your game to sell millions and millions and millions of copies, then that's something that's going to have to happen, right? However, games like, so on the screen right now, we have the indie game Doki Literature Club, which was released a few years back. And again, much like Undertale, was crafted by just one person. He did everything apart from the art. He couldn't draw, so he got somebody else to do it for him. But everything else was completely done by him. So it was just one person. So Doki Literature Club is an example of what we call a visual novel. A visual novel is a text-based game, usually Japanese in origin, although Doki Literature Club is Western. And this game is essentially a parody or an homage of the visual novel genre. It is very short. It's very straightforward, and I probably would recommend it with some caveats. And as we can see from the screenshot here, everything is very, very cutesy. The game markets itself as being a very cute kind of school simulator where you kind of meet girls and stuff like that, and you get to hang out and you get to do school activities. But if you look at the description of this game on Steam when you're downloading it, you'll see there is a warning. Warning, this game contains extreme scenes of violence and scenes which will be upsetting towards the audience, which is, of course, extremely confusing. So Here's a quick spoiler. So if you are interested in playing this, just stop listening. Doki Doki Literature Club is a ruse. It's a fake. It's not the cute schoolgirl game that it, seems to be on its outset. In actuality, it is a psychological horror game, and it is extremely disturbing. And as you go through the game, your very sense of perception and the very nature of what a video game is completely challenged. I don't really want to give too much away, because I think it's definitely a game which is definitely played completely sight unseen. This game really does mess with your mind. Which leads us on to the next point, and I've got to say that things do get fairly serious quite quickly. Although Doki Doki Literature Club is an excellent example of creative freedom, it's an excellent example of what can be accomplished in a game when it's made just purely by one person with no issues of financial constraint. This game is completely free. You can download it for free. You can nip off and download this for free right now. However, there are some issues that need to be considered with this, and there are going to be some big spoilers for this game on the next slide. This screenshot from The Sun from 2018. Just going to read this out. Suicide warning. What is the Doki Doki Literature Club? And why have schools issued a warning to parents over the DDLC online game? So this comes from a story of a very tragic story of someone who apparently killed themselves after playing this game. Now, one of the big themes of Doki Doki Literature Club is suicide and depression, which in general is something that the game does deal with in a fairly sensitive way, but it does deal with it in an extremely explicit way. There are often very frank and upsetting depictions of suicide within the game, which of course the game completely doesn't, well, it does warn you about, but it does seem like something that the game won't do. This raises a really important point about video games, and this is something that we'll have to consider throughout this unit. And this is this idea that video games can manipulate audiences, and that they can cause audiences to commit violent acts, and that even in some extreme circumstances they can also cause audiences to take their own life. Now, we need to look at this with a massive grain of salt. We need to consider exactly why this event happened, and we need to consider why it is that so many people played this game and were not affected by it, including myself. We also need to consider, well, is it actually ethically okay to release a game like Doki Doki Literature Club, a game which does deal with suicide in such an explicit manner and does actually have the potential to harm audiences? Now, one thing we have considered is that certain audiences are more easily manipulatable than other audiences, and audiences who are prone to issues such as depression potentially can have ideologies cultivated by games, but also by other products such as films and stuff like that. Which is why I guess it's important for games like Doki Doki Literature Club to have warnings and things like that. It's something that you're going to need to make up your own mind on. And just at this stage as well, given the kind of context and concepts that we're talking about, I would like to say that if you are affected by any of the issues that I have just discussed and would like to talk about them, you can, in the UK, phone the Samaritans on 116123 in order to talk to someone about these issues. So the idea that video games make people violent is an extremely important one. And this is something which is often reported in newspapers. And we can still see this negative perception of video games, which has existed in the media for many years. This idea that video games are trash and worthless, yes, but also the idea that video games are extremely violent and make you violent. And to be quite honest, it's quite hard to refute this idea that video games are extremely violent. Now, I've looked at a few examples, for example, Doki Doki Literature Club and Mario, which don't feature any guns or any ability to kill anybody or anything like that. But to be quite honest, you pull the vast majority of video games off a shelf in a video game store or go on a download site and check them out. My vast majority of them, you will be able to kill someone, often with a gun. And I guess probably the same could be said with films as well. The vast majority of films also, well, maybe the majority, I don't know. In video games, it's very, very much the case that a lot of problems are solved using violence. Now, does this mean that violent video games make people violent? Well, that's something we're going to need to consider in more depth later on. But this interesting and tragic article from this is from The Independent from 2008. Grand Theft Auto 4 is pulled from Thai shops after killing a taxi driver. So again, this kind of reflects this anxiety and this issue which exists with video games, this idea that video games can make people violent. And apparently this person essentially attempted to recreate a scene from Grand Theft Auto 4 by robbing a taxi driver and stabbing him. Obviously, we do need to take into consideration exactly how many copies of Grand Theft Auto 4 have been sold, exactly how many people have played this game without killing somebody, including myself. And we also really, really do need to consider the mental health of the person in this situation. And personally, it would be my own personal argument that nobody kills somebody unless they do have underlying mental health issues. And, a video game isn't going to cause someone to kill somebody. And if it wasn't a video game, then it would have been a book. It would have been a TV show. It could have been absolutely anything. But anyway, you need to understand that this stigma against video games does exist. And you need to understand that there are many debates about violent video games. There are also controversies which surround the production of video games. So as I mentioned with Gears of War earlier on, video games generally now take hundreds and hundreds of people to make a video game, often working ridiculously long hours for a long, long period of time. So we've kind of moved away from this idea of video games being made by a single person in their bedroom over a period of weeks. And now we have the situation like with games like LA Noire, which is on the screen now, and more recently Red Dead Redemption 2, where games take many, many years to make, and they take many hundreds, if not thousands, of people to make. And this often does, if, many reports, if they are to be believed, this does involve the exploitation of people making these games. And this does involve extremely intense working environments. So from LA Noire, there are a number of issues which arose during the production of this game. It was a ridiculously technologically advanced game which required a ridiculous amount of coding expertise and man hours that were put into the game as well. And many reports surfaced during and especially after the game's release of the pretty horrible working conditions of working for the game. And even people who complained about their working conditions being fired and their names being taken off the credits as well. So we can see that through this competition and through this, the massive financial implications of video games and their profitability, we can also see the same old poor working practices emerging in them as well. So this is something that we need to consider. And I think this is also something that you need to consider as well for a game like Red Dead Redemption 2. Are you okay playing a video game where potentially the people who made it were exploited? Or do you think that video games should be judged on their own merits and the context in which they were made shouldn't actually be taken into account? So something you need to think about there. There are also controversies surrounding representation. Video games, as we've mentioned, are often extremely violent, and they often involve problems being solved through murdering people extremely violently. But there are also issues in terms of the representation of female characters in particular and their sexualization. Now, this is something which exists in both Western and Japanese games, and definitely exists in Japanese games to a much greater degree. Example guys want to look at now is this game Tomb Raider, which was released by EIDOS and developed by Core in 1995, 1996. Let's say 1995. One of the interesting things about Tomb Raider is that you're playing a woman, which is wonderful. And this woman has extremely large breasts, very, very exaggerated, extremely large breasts. And especially marketing material for this game, her sexualization was very, very much emphasized. And if you want to check that out, just like, Google like Tomb Raider advert or something like that. Now, in subsequent entries into the Tomb Raider series, they've really toned down the sexualization there. But it really does raise this important point. I mean, on the one hand, it's cool. We've got a video game that stars a woman. And from this shot here, she seems to be fairly sensibly dressed for breaking into a tomb, although she probably could be wearing slightly longer trousers. However, very, very heavily sexualized in a lot of marketing for this game as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. If the only way we can get women into video games is through sexualizing them, then obviously that is going to be an issue. And there have been a number of video games since which have dealt with women in video games in a much, much more sensitive way. And I generally think things are going in a fairly nice direction in terms of that. Finally, we need to consider briefly how video games are distributed. So, as I said previously, if you want to play a video game, the very, very early days of video games, you actually had to be working in a university in order to get your hands on the computer, because nobody could afford a computer. That's just something that nobody had a computer. And then after that, you had to take 25 cents and you had to go down to an arcade. And then after that, you had to pay for a game console at home and then go down to the shop in order to buy a video game. And nowadays, things are a little bit different. Most games are not bought physically, but they are bought digitally. And this is something which is actually a fairly recent innovation in the video game industry. Now, digital distribution is something which is much, much more popular in the West than it is in the East. In Japan, they still very much favor buying physical games, although I have included an image here of a Japanese digital distribution service, the PlayStation Store. And on the bottom right here, we have Steam, which is probably the biggest and most profitable PC-based digital distribution service. So essentially, through these portals, players can find video games, and using a credit card or a PayPal account, they can download whatever game they want, which negates the need to go down to the shop and to actually buy something, which of course gives audiences a massive advantage there. So in this video, we have considered very briefly the history of the video game industry. And I say very briefly, obviously I've rattled along for a very, very long time, but with something with this much depth, I can't really go through it in kind of basic detail. And basically, you're not going to be able to talk about 99% of this stuff in the exam because you're just not going to have time. But this still does give you the context for which to briefly talk about this in the exam. So, in what ways do video games represent a specialized industry, and how do they differ from other media? Well, this potentially is a question, or something like this is a question that you could face in the exam. And this is something which is really important. The video game industry is specialized. It is totally different from any other industry. And we haven't even looked at actual games themselves. We haven't really thought about what it's actually like to play games. We haven't even thought about this idea that when you play a game, you are taking on the role of somebody or something or some concept in some games. Unlike a film where you may identify the characters, but you're not going to say, I'm doing this. In a video game, you're taking on a completely different role. Sometimes. So that's something which is extremely important to consider. It's an extremely specialized industry. It is distributed, it is created in a way which is completely different to any other industry. In the video game industry, we have this interrelationship between independent producers and major label producers, which, although similar to something like the music industry or something like that, on the one hand, if you want to make an absolutely huge video game, well, you're going to need thousands of people in order to make it. However, if you guys wanted to make a video game right now, you could just Google it. You could download something like Unity, which is available for free on a personal level for the most basic version of it. And you could spend the rest of the week learning how to make a video game. And by the end of the week, you would have made a small and pretty terrible video game, but you can still make one. So there's an extremely low barrier to entry, and you could distribute this online, and then maybe you'd get famous. So just think about a couple of these. What makes video games different? What makes video games specialized? So number one, interactivity. So this idea that when you play a video game that you are interacting, that you are the player, that you are the character on screen to a certain extent, and you are doing the stuff on screen and you are making these choices. You are pushing these buttons and you are somehow shaping the narrative as opposed to witnessing and decoding the narrative. Second point is huge expenditure of resources. Video games often take thousands of people to make, but also they don't. I mean, some video games take one person to make, and there's a lot of excellent video games which are just made by one person. Video games tend to have a much higher RRP, that's recommended retail price. Video games tend to be much more expensive than other forms of media. In order to buy a new PlayStation 4 game at RRP, you're looking at £50, although pricing of video games does vary wildly. If you wanted to buy a game on day one, that's how much money you're going to be forking out, which is way, way more than going to the cinema even. Video games tend to be much, much longer than other forms of media, for example, films. So while you might get fidgety after maybe 2 or 3 hours of watching a film, it's fairly normal for a video game to be 50, 60 hours plus, or at the very least, a short video game would be considered to be something like 8 or 10 hours long, which is, again, significantly longer than a film. Video games also traditionally have a dedicated or core target audience. So this is something that we see, like something like a film, for example. We can consider films to have a mass market audience. Who doesn't watch films? I'd like to meet someone who doesn't watch films. I don't think that they exist, or at least hopefully they don't exist in media studies students anyway. However, video games tend to have a core audience. They tend to have a dedicated and niche audience. If someone says, I play video games, it's like, ooh, you're a gamer. Video gamers tend to traditionally and perhaps stereotypically be more dedicated to video games, which is fairly different from people who watch films or TV shows or stuff like that. Additionally, video games are completely different in the way in which they're created, in the way in which they're distributed. So I keep mentioning things like PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. You cannot play a PlayStation 4 game on an Xbox One console. So if there's a game that comes out for a console that you don't own, because they're very expensive and you can only really own one unless you're rich, then you're stuffed, basically. Video games have always been like this, and they've been even worse in the past as well, when there were many, many different options to choose from. This idea that games are released for a specific hardware platform, so that, there are PlayStation 4 games, there are Xbox One games. Many games are released multi-platform, so for example, the Dark Souls series, you can get that on Xbox, and you can get it on PlayStation and Switch as well. But if you want to play something like Gears of War, then you have to play it on Xbox. And if you want to play something like Death Stranding, then you're going to have to get a PlayStation 4. So video games are very, very different. I mean, can you imagine that for films? Can you imagine getting a Universal Blu-ray? Can you imagine getting Jurassic Park on Blu-ray, but then not being able to play it on your Blu-ray player at home because you don't own a Universal Blu-ray player? It's just completely mind-boggling. But this is the way in which video games work. So each and every one of these points is highly debatable. This has been a very, very long video, so I'm going to sign off now. But essentially, hopefully, this gives you a flavor of the video game industry, and also gives you a flavor of how the video game industry is specialized and how it is different from every other industry.